Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the 81st Annual Dinner Meeting of the Economic Club of Chicago. Before we begin our program, I just have one club announcement. This year's fifth night celebration will take place on Wednesday, June 3rd at the Adler Planetarium. This year marks the International Year of Astronomy, celebrating 4 centuries of astronomers and astronomical milestones. The evening will allow members and guests to tour the museum at their leisure while enjoying an ongoing cocktail buffet. In addition to the outstanding regular exhibits, there'll be special activities to participate in and interactive presentations for all to enjoy. The evening will conclude with a dazzling display of fireworks at sunset. This promises to be a great event, and we encourage you to bring guests of all ages, appropriate children, obviously. An email announcement will be sent to all of you sometime at the end of this month. And now, in compliance with the bylaws of the club, Thomas A. Cole, 2009-2010 Nominating Committee Chair and partner and chairman of the Executive Committee of Sidley and Austin, will present this year's Nominating Committee slate.
Thank you, Bill. On behalf of this year's nominating committee, I am very pleased to present the following slate. As is the club's custom, I will present the complete slate before the vote is called. For chairman, John W. Rogers, Jr., Chairman, CEO, and Chief Investment Officer, Ariel Investments. For first vice chairman, Chris Reyes, Chairman, Reyes Holdings. Second vice chairman and a 3-year term as a director, John A. Challenger, Chief Executive Officer, Challenger, Gray, and Christmas. For treasurer, Donna Zarconi, President and CEO, DF Zarconi and Associates. For secretary and a 1-year term as director, Kevin Sheehan, Managing Director, Entrust Capital. For the executive committee for a 1-year term, Deb DeHaas, Vice Chairman and Regional Managing Partner, Deloitte & Touche. Roberto Herencia, former President, Banco Popular, North America. Penny Pritzker, President and CEO, Pritzker Realty Group. David B. Spear, Chairman and CEO, Illinois Toolworks. Michael W. Farrow, Chairman and CEO, Merrick Ventures. For a 3-year term as director, Carol L. Bernick, Executive Chairman, Alberto Culver. Charles Lowe Evans, President and CEO, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Dennis Holzschneider, President, DePaul University. Michael J. Sachs, Chief Executive Officer, Grosvenor Capital. William H. Strong, Vice Chairman, Investment Banking, Morgan Stanley. And finally, David B. Weinberg, Chairman and CEO, Judd Enterprises.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to call for a motion for the adoption of the slate.
That's my line. I so move.
Do we have a second? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Rich taught me how to do that. Yeah. Rich really liked that one. Thanks very much, Tom, and to the nominating committee for bringing obviously such a excellent slate of candidates before you, and I'm sure they will enjoy the next 2 years as they lead this great club. Let me also express our appreciation to the directors and the officers who have served over this last year or 2 years. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers table. As I call their names, I'll ask each to stand and remain standing until the introductions have been completed. Please hold your applause until they're all introduced. Beginning at my far left, Wendy Chronister, Chief Executive Officer, Chronister Oil Company. Ron Culp, Partner and Managing Director, Ketchum, and a Director of the club. Allison Chung, President, Teamworks. Manny Sanchez, Managing Partner, Sanchez, Daniels & Hoffman, and a Director of the club. Christopher B. Begley, Chairman and CEO, Hospira, and Director of the club. Lyle Logan, Executive Vice President and Managing Director, Northern Trust Global Investment Services, and Director of the club. Mike Koldyke, Founder and Chairman Emeritus, Golden Apple, and Academy for Urban School Leadership. Marcia Bouton, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Robert S. Murley, Vice Chairman of Investment Banking, Credit Suisse, and Director of the club. William J. Brodsky, Chairman and CEO, Chicago Board of Options Exchange. Melody Hobson, President, Ariel Investments, and Director of the club. James A. Bell, Corporate President and CFO, The Boeing Corporation, Treasurer and Director of the club. James M. Houlihan, Cook County Assessor, Cook County Assessor's Office. Elaine Leavenworth, Vice President, Government Affairs, Abbott. Tom Cole, Partner and Chairman of the Executive Committee, Sidley and Austin. And Newt Minow, Counsel, Sidley and Austin. Beginning at my far right, Dean Chung, Managing Director, Insight Out. Cam Finlay, Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporation, and Director of the club. John Rao, President and CEO, Miami Corporation. Donna Sarconi, President and CEO, DF Sarconi and Associates, and Director of the club. Samuel K. Skinner, former Secretary of Transportation and former Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. Sheila Penrose, Chairman, Jones Lang LaSalle. Ron Gidwitz, Partner, GCG Partners. Frank M. Church, Chairman and CEO, Frank M. Clark, Chairman and CEO, ComEd. John A. Edwardson, Chairman and CEO, CDW Corporation. Gary E. Holdren, Chairman and CEO, Urin Consulting Group, and also a Director of the club. Jack Sander, Special Policy Advisor, retired Chairman of the Board and member of the Executive Committee, CME Group. John W. Rogers, Jr., Chairman and CEO and Chief Investment Officer, Ariel Investments. Brenda C. Barnes, Chairman and CEO, Sara Lee Corporation, and Director of the club. Michael W. Farrow, Jr., Chairman, Merrick Ventures and Merge Healthcare, and also a Director of the club. The Honorable Richard M. Daley, Mayor of the City of Chicago. Thank you very much. Let me also acknowledge the presence of the First Lady of Chicago, Maggie Daley. Maggie. And as the custom of the club, we will take a 10-minute intermission. It's only 10 to 8. We get going at 8:05. If I could ask you all, please, to begin to take your seats.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. You did that. Do a good job. Thank you. I'm here. How you doing, Uncle?
Could I ask you all to please take your seats? Our 10-minute intermission is over. Shh. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's an old saying, friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. But our guest tonight gets that saying exactly backwards. If Dick Durbin becomes your friend, he stays your friend. And his enemies are never his enemies for long. Friends have meant a lot to Dick's political career. He once said, and I quote, "I lost 3 elections before I ever won one, and the only thing that kept me going were friends who never gave up on me." Among those friends were giants of Illinois politics and his predecessors in the United States Senate, Paul Douglas and Paul Simon. Dick was first elected to Congress in 1982 from the district that once sent Abraham Lincoln to Washington. After 7 terms, he won the Senate seat vacated by Paul Simon, his mentor. Everyone says he's a nice guy, and they're right. But that doesn't mean Dick Durbin is afraid of a fight. When he was 14, his father died of lung cancer, and in Congress, he has taken on big tobacco many, many times. Dick's the ultimate professional. Dick's the ultimate professional, but he takes the work personally, and he stands by his principles. Probably the best example was his position against the Iraq War resolution in 2002. He was up for re-election, but he never hesitated. He's called it, quote, "one of my best votes." Of course, Dick knows when not to fight, too, like the time someone suggested he mediate the budget battle between the governor and the legislature a couple of years ago. He said he'd rather deal with the Sunnis and Shiites than an open civil war. He gets along so well with people because he's the genuine article. Dick has seen life's highs and lows. Last fall, a personal tragedy befell him and his wife, and 3 days later, he watched his fellow Illinois senator and friend elected president of the United States. That's another thing they say about friends. It's good to have them in high places. Dick is a longtime Barack Obama fan. He urged him to run for the Senate, and then he urged him to run for president, well before even the candidate thought that it was feasible. Of course, as Majority Whip, Dick Durbin has lots of friends by his side today. Last fall, a former congressman who served with Dick for more than 25 years said, "When Senator Obama becomes president, he'll be one of the most important men in the free world, but he'll be the second most powerful Illinoisan in Washington." And Dick wields that power wisely. When he disagrees, he's never personal. When he advocates, he's never shrill. That's why Dick is a friend to people on both sides of the aisle and across all the political spectrum. He is a friend to all the hardworking people of this great state and city, and I am proud to say he's a friend to me. Ladies and gentlemen, the senior senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. That was a great introduction. And thanks for your great work as chairman of the Economic Club of Chicago. To the club president, Grace Berry, who invited me here this evening, she deserves a round of applause. Especially because 4 days ago, she became a grandmother of Ronan. Congratulations, Grace. I want to acknowledge Mayor Rich Daley. And I want to tell you that Rich and I go back quite a few years. When he was a state senator in Springfield and chairman of the State Senate Judiciary Committee, his legal counsel was a fellow named Dick Durbin, some 31 years ago. And we prided ourselves on that committee, killing more bills than ever killed in the history of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which might have been the best thing we could have done for our state, Rich. That's for sure. I am such a fan of Rich and what he does as mayor of Chicago and this great city. It's such an honor to represent. But he has really come into his own in this pursuit of the 2016 Olympics. What a fantastic job he has done. He's so caught up in it. I mean, we were sitting here talking, and the next thing I know, Bill and I had agreed to join Rich in entering a bobsled team in Vancouver. We need a fourth, so we'll talk to you later about that. Grace was kind enough to send me a copy of the 75th anniversary book of this club, which I enjoyed reading. Mr. Melvin Traylor, president of the First National Bank of Chicago, spoke at the first meeting of this distinguished group in 1927. The topic of Mr. Traylor's remarks was, "Why the hell another club in Chicago?" And this is how he answered his own question. He said Chicago was filled with clubs of idealistic critics and dreamers, and clubs of hard-boiled, unimaginative, close-fisted materialists. And, quote, "Somewhere between the two, there should be a place for a little less political thinking, a little less selfish preaching, a place for just some common sense." The economy of Chicago itself has changed dramatically over the 82 years since the Economic Club was founded. The city has changed from a city of steel mills and stockyards to a center for global finance and commerce. One thing that hasn't changed for the last 82 years, thank goodness, is your adherence to plain-speaking, clear-thinking values. The Economic Club of Chicago continues to provide an important forum for candid, common-sense discussions of the issues of the day. I hope that I'll add to that tradition tonight. Now, before I address, certainly a round of applause, before I address tonight's topic, I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story about a room in the United States Capitol. It's just off the Senate chamber, and it's down a tiled corridor. It's room 219. It's close by the Senate chamber, so we use it a lot for important meetings. A few years ago, on a Tuesday morning, I went into that room at 9 o'clock in the morning for a leadership meeting with then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Everyone was buzzing about the news report we'd heard as we walked in a room that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center just moments earlier. Someone turned on a TV in that room for an update, and in an instant, we saw the second plane hit the South Tower. We tried to start our meeting, but were interrupted by a news flash of an explosion at the Pentagon. At that point, everybody got out of their chairs and looked out the window down the mall. What we saw was thick, billowing black smoke coming across the mall from a plane crashing into the Pentagon. Seconds later, notification that the White House was being evacuated, and we were all told to leave the building. We all know that America has not been the same since that day. Now, fast forward from 9/11/2001 to 7 years later, another Tuesday in September, another meeting in room 219. Sitting at the meeting were Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and Secretary of the Treasury Henry Paulson, all of the assembled leadership, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans. And we were told that within hours that AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, would fail, and its collapse would bring down thousands of contracts they insured all around the world. Chairman Bernanke said that he was moving immediately to send $85 billion to prop up AIG and avoid a global economic catastrophe. His statement to us about the $85 billion was met with an awkward, almost stunned silence. Finally, one senator had the nerve to ask the question we all were thinking: where did the Federal Reserve get $85 billion? Bernanke answered, "Oh, we have some funds." The next and obvious question is, by what authority did you give $85 billion to a private company? Bernanke said there was a law passed during the Great Depression that gave the Federal Reserve general authority to do things necessary for the good of the economy. Well, a few days later, in another meeting of the same group, with Bernanke, Paulson, Chris Cox, head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we were told point blank that if Congress didn't produce hundreds of billions of dollars quickly, that the American economy faced a severe economic crisis which could spread across the world. Shortly after that request, just a few days later, Congress voted to create the Troubled Assets Relief Program. We basically gave Secretary Paulson and the Bush administration a blank check. Our alternative was to do nothing and hope that they were wrong. But we saw the failure of major financial institutions, the growing unemployment rate, and record home foreclosures, and we saw them as evidence that we were witnessing an economic challenge of historic proportions. That was nearly 7 months ago. Seems like a lot longer. Since then, American taxpayers have had to commit not just billions, but trillions of dollars to prevent our financial system from collapsing and our economy from falling into a depression. Yet, despite those sacrifices, our economy continues to shed jobs at an alarming rate. 2 million jobs lost just in the last 3 months. More than 5 million jobs lost since the recession started 2 years ago. All told, 13 million Americans now unemployed. The national jobless rate jumped to 8.1 in February. In Illinois, it's 8.6%. More than 570,000 people in our state are now out of work. In December and January, we were losing jobs at the rate of 1,200 a day in the state of Illinois. In the Chicago area, things are tough as well. 126,000 people in this area lost jobs last year. The jobless rate in the Chicago metro area is now 9.2%, higher than New York City. Many businesses can't borrow or make payroll. Workers and retirees are seeing their life savings disappear. Millions of families who 2 years ago had accumulated wealth in their home equity and their 401ks now have neither. American families lost a total of $11 trillion last year, 18% of their total wealth. Average Americans are working harder and falling further behind. According to the Federal Reserve, the net worth of the average American household, adjusted for inflation, is lower now than it was in 2001. While some of the very companies whose recklessness helped cause this crisis receive billions of dollars from taxpayers, millions of hardworking average Americans lose their jobs, their health care, and their homes. Is it any wonder that people are angry about the staggering costs of this crisis and the apparent indifference of some corporate leaders at the same failed businesses who still want to cash in? Think about this. We have now allocated $10.5 trillion to fix the damage caused to the financial markets and our economy by this crisis. And we have already spent $2.6 trillion on this crisis. $2.6 trillion. For an amount less than that, we could eliminate our nation's entire backlog of infrastructure needs. We could rebuild our crumbling roads and bridges, every mile of deteriorating railroad line, every failing dam and levee, and upgrade every overwhelmed water treatment plant in America. For an amount far less than that, we could ensure that every uninsured man, woman, and child in America has basic health coverage for 10 years. And we still have to do these things, but the cost of this crisis will make it harder. So people have a right to feel upset and angry, but as we saw following our last great national crisis, there can be a high cost to acting in anger and haste without sufficient understanding. What we need to do now is what Mr. Traylor called for 82 years ago at this club: common sense, practical economics, to restore balance to our markets and solid, sustainable growth in our economy. Thankfully, I believe we have the right leader for these times. As Bill mentioned to you, I was one of Barack Obama's early cheerleaders. In November of 2006, wrapping up a speech at the Union League Club, 5 o'clock on an afternoon, I said to him, "Barack, I got to talk to you." And we grabbed a meeting room at the Union League Club that nobody was sitting in and closed the door. And I said to him, "Buddy, you got to run for president." And he said, "What about Hillary?" I said, "Well, that's an issue. There's no question about it." But he said he needed to talk to Michelle about it, and he'd get back to me in a few weeks. After the first of the year, he said he was leaning toward the idea, but hadn't made up his mind. So I decided to give him a little nudge. I was the first member of the Senate to endorse Barack for president. For 12 months, I was the only senator who endorsed Barack Obama for president. But after 14 trips to Iowa and a lot of other states, in came the Iowa caucus. And as a result of that night, his campaign was launched. It was a political dream come true to be seated on that platform just a few weeks ago when President Obama was sworn in, to watch him place his hand on the same small Bible that Abraham Lincoln had used at his inauguration a century and a half before. Now, when I look at the enormity of the challenges that he's inherited, I sometimes wonder if I really did him a favor. But I'm grateful every day that he and Michelle decided to give the campaign their all and the American people decided to give Barack Obama a chance to lead this nation. I believe he's the right person for this job. He has the temperament, the intellect, the values, and extraordinary leadership abilities that I've never seen in another elected official to bring this country together and to weather this terrible storm. He's been president for only 78 days, and already he's taken major steps. 2 weeks after taking office, President Obama signed the most sweeping economic recovery bill in history. The economic stimulus plan will save or create 3.5 million jobs over the next 2 years and give 95% of American families an $800 tax cut starting this month. It provides relief for states, workers, and families who are bearing the brunt of this crisis, $4 billion in stimulus funds to help our own state of Illinois through its budget crisis, extension of unemployment benefits and health insurance for those who've lost work, and it enables us to start to rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure, investments that will serve us for decades to come. Last week, we passed the budget resolution in both the House and the Senate. During the debate, some of the critics of the resolution said we need to cut government spending. I understand that sentiment. We do have to be concerned about government spending. Over the last 8 years, the size of our national debt has doubled. President Obama inherited a $1 trillion budget deficit, which he's committed to cutting in half in 4 years. We know government can't solve every problem, but there are some problems that can't be solved without strong government leadership. This recession is one of them. America's gross domestic product is about $14 trillion a year. We anticipate this year Americans will spend about $1 billion less than they would have ordinarily. That $1 trillion, about 7 or 8% of our nation's economy, is lost purchasing power when it comes to goods and services. With businesses and consumers cutting back, only government can fill that void at this point. Only government can break this vicious cycle that's crippling our economy, where lack of spending spreads to job loss, business failure, which leads to even less spending, where an inability to lend and borrow stops growth, which leads to even less credit. And without the free flow of credit, our economy can't recover, which is why the President and Treasury Secretary Geithner have also laid the groundwork for rescuing the banking system and restoring lending. Their financial stability plan increases the capital available to banks and seeks out private capital to match the public investments to clean up toxic assets. It helps small businesses find loans, and it brings greater transparency and accountability to the use of taxpayers' money. That's critical, because as the President has said, repairing and rebuilding our economy is going to take patience and persistence, and it's also going to take public trust. If the American people think their tax dollars are being misused, wasted, public anger will increase, and the difficult task of fixing the economy becomes even harder. For moral as well as practical reasons, that can't be allowed to happen. The financial stability plan laid out by President and Secretary Geithner does something else that's essential. It creates a fair and effective way to end this mortgage crisis. Remember, this crisis started with subprime mortgages. Too many bad mortgages were written and used to create too many complex securities, which were then sold to too many unsuspecting investors around the world. When the inevitable happened, and many of those risky mortgages began to fail, the securities lost their values, and investors lost their money, panic set in, the markets froze up. We tried letting the markets solve this, but it didn't work. The crisis deepened. In February, 14,000 homes were in foreclosure in Illinois. That's up 62% from 1 year ago. Median home prices in our state fell nearly 21% last year. In the city of Chicago, nearly 25%. No zip code has been spared. You can find foreclosures in neighborhoods with small, modest homes and million-dollar homes. But some neighborhoods are really devastated. Albany Park is on the north side of the city, close to Lincoln Square. Since this mortgage crisis started in 2006, foreclosures in Albany Park have increased 374%. I recently was invited to meet with some of the residents of the 4400 block of North Kedzie in Albany Park. It's a kind of community that is so typical of Chicago. Neat, well-kept family homes, but in their midst was a three-flat, boarded up with plywood with a for sale sign. The building had been vandalized, the plumbing ripped out. The neighbors suspected the vacant building had become a haven for gang activities, and they were afraid for their kids. That one foreclosed property was changing life and property values in what had been a solid neighborhood, and the people still living there were watching the cancer of that foreclosure spread across their neighborhood, and they were madder than hell. The Chicago Lawn neighborhood, zip code 60629, you may not recognize it right off the top of your head, but if you've flown into Midway, you flew right over it. It's right next to the airport. You know what it looks like because you look down as I do, taking off and landing. It's filled with neat, compact, blonde brick bungalow homes with a fair share of above-ground swimming pools in the backyard. Starter homes for a lot of young couples and a solid neighborhood for working families for decades. Not long ago, a community group called Southwest Organizing Project showed me a map of zip code 60629. The map had a red dot for every home in foreclosure as of September last year, before the foreclosure fires really started to rage. I counted only 5 blocks in that entire zip code that had been spared. Foreclosure is not the end of the story. The New York Times ran a story last week on the latest phase in the foreclosure crisis: bank walkaways. According to the article, in many cities, banks are quietly declining to take possession of properties at the end of foreclosure, most often because the cost of the ordeal, from legal fees to maintenance, exceeds the diminishing value of the real estate. We can't rely on the markets alone to solve this crisis. The President's Homeowner Affordability and Stability Plan recognizes that fact. It will help between 7 and 9 million homeowners stay in their homes, helping them to refinance into lower cost mortgages if their loans are in good standing, or restructure their mortgages if they're in danger of losing to foreclosure. Lenders receive incentives to restructure mortgages, and they'll get a better deal than they'd get in foreclosure. The lenders won't have to face the legal headaches and losses of foreclosure. And if lenders still refuse for some reason to even discuss modifying a mortgage, the President's plan gives homeowners new leverage to negotiate by allowing bankruptcy judges to rewrite mortgages on primary residences. No mortgage could be lowered below the fair market value in bankruptcy, so lenders would come out ahead of where they would have in foreclosure. I've been working on this idea for over 2 years. It is controversial, and some of you know that. But when I first suggested it, I said we need to do it because we're facing the threat of nearly 2 million foreclosures in 2 years. My critics said, "Durbin, you're crazy. It can't happen." That was less than a year and a half ago. Today, Goldman Sachs warns us that if we fail to halt the mortgage meltdown, we could see 13 million foreclosures over the next 5 years. That's 1 out of every 5 mortgages in America, a foreclosure on every block. I want to salute Mayor Daley and city officials, Sheriff Tom Dart, Attorney General Lisa Madigan, Treasurer Alexi Janulius, and others in our state who are demonstrating real leadership and ingenuity in battling this foreclosure crisis. But they can't hold back the tide by themselves. We need a national solution to a national crisis. The Senate is likely to take up the housing bill as soon as we return in 2 weeks. I'm working with the banking industry, and we are close to an agreement. I hope we can reach it for the good of our country and for those who are facing foreclosure. Once we get through this crisis, we simply can't go back to the way things were before. AIG Financial Products, the company whose reckless risk-taking and dramatic over-leveraging nearly brought down the global finance system, was able to operate as it did in part because it set up shop in London, beyond the reach of U.S. regulators. AIG's London caper may have escaped the reach of U.S. regulators, but the bailout of the mess that they created landed smack dab in the laps of the U.S. taxpayers. The government agencies charged with overseeing our financial markets didn't keep up with changes in the markets, didn't recognize the new risks. And a large part of our financial system, hedge funds, non-bank lenders, over-the-counter derivatives trading, and private equity funds are not properly overseen by any regulatory agency. None. As Secretary Geithner said recently in testimony before Congress, our system failed in fundamental ways. To address this will require comprehensive reform, not modest repairs at the margins, but new rules of the game. The challenge is always to find the right balance. The new rules have to be strong enough to protect the safety, soundness, and integrity of our markets without stifling American entrepreneurial spirit, innovation, and creativity. To find that balance, President Obama and Secretary Geithner are proposing the creation of a new systemic regulator, that would be charged with identifying and preventing systemic risk. They're working to eliminate dangerous gaps in the current system. As he did last week at the G20 meeting in London, President Obama is working to foster international cooperation for similar comprehensive reform measures around the world. President Obama has also said we need some new rules to protect consumers and investors, and he's right. Right now, financial service companies are regulated by a crazy quilt of 10 different federal regulators. Each has some nominal responsibility to look out for consumers, but none has consumer protection as primary focus. We have a federal agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that warns us about toxic lead paint in our kids' toys. But we don't have a federal agency to warn the American public about toxic mortgages and other high-risk credit products. I've introduced a bill with Senator Schumer entitled the Financial Product Safety Commission to evaluate mortgages, credit cards, car loans, and other consumer financial products. Weed out the products that are so risky or misleading that they're dangerous. Companies that offer good products at reasonable rates will have nothing to fear. In fact, they'll benefit by not having to compete against unscrupulous companies offering misleading products. Elizabeth Warren, some of you may know, is the Harvard law professor who oversees the implementation of the TARP program. She first proposed this idea to me. She believes that an agency like this could have averted the subprime mortgage crisis. It ought to be the part of the new rules of our financial system. I hope it will be. And the savings exceed the cost. Some people wonder, what is the cost of government and regulation? Let me give you a couple examples of why appropriate regulation is the right thing to do for good business. Mattel Toys alone lost more in sales from the last year's toy recalls than the entire annual budget of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which had the responsibility to keep those toys off the market. Peanut producers lost more from the recent peanut recall than the entire annual budget of the Food and Drug Administration. Appropriate government oversight is important to consumers and it's important to business. Let me give you one example close to home. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange is a global success because it is an honest marketplace, managed by professionals, guided by the rule of law, and standards of transparency and accountability guaranteed by our government. Between 1997 and 2007, however, trading volume increased more than tenfold at CME, while staffing levels at the agency responsible for oversight, the Commodity Future Trading Commission, dropped 21% in the same period of time. A tenfold increase in trades, 21% decline in the number of staffers, and their technology can't keep up with the volume of transactions. A strong CFTC is essential to the reputation and continued success of the CME in a global economy. The last point I want to make is to quote President Obama, and he said, "We must not use the need to confront financial problems as an excuse to keep ignoring long-term threats to our prosperity. The cost of health care and our oil addiction, the education deficit, and our fiscal deficit. Even as we dig ourselves out of this current economic crisis and rewrite the rules to prevent the next crisis, we have to plan and invest in our long-term economic growth." The stimulus plan was a first step. Last week, Congress took the next step with the budget resolution to make long-term investments in health care, education, the environment, and energy independence. The budget choices the President has made and Congress has endorsed will make us a stronger nation, more sustainable and more just. It will also include a commitment to reduce the deficit. It will restore balance and responsibility. When I read that 75th anniversary album from your club, there was another passage that caught my attention. It was a letter to the club's second president from the president of a local printing company. The letter was dated November 17, 1933. At that point, Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 8 months. It was still the depths of the Depression. The club member wrote that he'd recently seen a petition that was being circulated to be sent to President Franklin Roosevelt. And it quoted him as saying, "To persuade Roosevelt to stop spending the vast sums of money for land improvements, power development, and other supposedly relief measures." Went on to say, "The feeling is that the children and our children's children are the ones who will have to pay through the nose." Well, we are the children and the children's children that gentleman was worried about so many years ago. We hear his words echoed today from those who oppose the President's plan to deal with this crisis. But when you hear that critics hear those critics, look at Chicago's magnificent lakefront, at Grant Park, Outer Drive, Midway Airport. Remember, they were all completed under the New Deal. And remember how inspired public investments had yielded great benefits for generations. With the President's leadership and a united America and the support of leaders like yourself, I have no doubt that we'll weather this crisis. Thank you for inviting me to join you this evening.
Thank you very much, Senator. As you know, the custom of the club is that the Questions Committee provides a number of questions on a wide range of subjects for our honorees. So, Dick, we will start with the first one. You talked about President Obama. Let me ask you, you've served as senator under 3 different presidents, President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama. Even though it is short in President Obama's tenure, what are the differences in their leadership styles?
That's not an easy question. Well, I would say, as far as President Clinton was concerned, that he was an aggressive leader who was listening to a lot of advisors, and a man who, as those who are in the White House now tell me, would sometimes start a meeting and it would never end. He was so curious and asked a lot of questions, and went forward from there. Of course, he had his own share of problems, which I won't get into here, but I will tell you that I think we have to concede the obvious, and that is that during his 8 years in office, it was the most dramatic uptick of our economy that we'd seen in modern times. By the end of his term, we were starting to generate the surpluses in the federal budget that we'd seen in over 30 years. When it came to home ownership and business creation and improvements in the standard of living, a lot of positive things were done by an extraordinarily good team, including a Secretary of Commerce and a Secretary of the Treasury and others who helped him succeed. President Bush and I did not see eye to eye on a lot of things, and he had a totally different style. Best I could gather, he started every meeting exactly on time and ended it on time. You just knew if you came 5 minutes late, you were going to be 5 minutes late for his meeting. He always started them promptly. I think he relied heavily, at least as an outside observer, on people like Vice President Cheney, Secretary Rumsfeld, and others for a lot of advice on subjects. I didn't get as close to him as I might have, being in the opposite political party. I can say of President Obama that those who work with him now say that when he invites a diverse group in the room, he expects everybody invited to speak their opinion before they leave. He is a thoughtful person. I've known him, as many of us in this room know him, over the years. I know that there isn't an issue too technical or too complicated for him to tackle. I think he's a person of really sound values, and I would not have encouraged him to run for president if I didn't believe he could do a good job.
In your opinion, what will happen to the people who are currently being held at Guantanamo Bay? Where will they go, and should they be released?
The cast of people at Guantanamo has changed over the years. It isn't one set group of people. There have been literally hundreds, 400 or 500 or so, who've been incarcerated there from time to time. And in any given year, we would release 100 or 200 of them when we found that there were no charges against them. There are some very bad people there. There's no question about it, and dangerous people who should not be released. For them, I think ultimately they should be charged and incarcerated. That, I think, is the system of justice that we have used. We are struggling now with working our way through the status of these people in our legal system. There are some that we brought into this system which nobody wants. The Uyghurs out of China are an example, a group of people that can't return to where they were seized, and no one will take them. I don't know the answer in terms of their fate. But I will say this. I thought that President Obama did one of his most significant things in the first 78 days when his first announcement was his statement that the United States would not engage in the use of torture and that we would close Guantanamo. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the historian who passed away a couple of years ago, said that the issue of torture had done more to damage the reputation of the United States in the world than anything. I'm afraid he might have been right. I think the president turned the page, importantly so, and really said what an overwhelming number of members of Congress had said. When we considered that issue in the United States Senate, the sponsor of the resolution was John McCain. Who in the United States Congress could have spoken with more authority to the issue of torture? And it was John McCain who said, even during the Bush administration, we shouldn't engage in these practices. That resolution passed with over 90 votes in the United States Senate. That really should be our policy, and I'm glad that President Obama started with that announcement.
What kinds of practical health care reforms are likely to emerge from Congress, assuming that a single-payer system is unlikely?
I'll need a doctor. We are currently spending more money per capita than any nation in the world on health care. And I don't think we have the results to show for it. When we consider our hospitals and our technology and the quality of our health care system, I can't think of another place in the world that I'd rather be sick than the United States. But there are such gross disparities in our health care today. 47 million people without any health insurance, and the number grows by the day. A lot of people with health insurance that's worth very little. And great disparities in cost. Under Medicare, a surgical procedure in Miami, the same procedure, costs twice as much as it does in Minneapolis. There's no good explanation for that. There are ways for us to bring real economy to this system, and I think we need to do that. I can't think of a greater challenge for everyone in this room, individuals, families and businesses, governments, than dealing with the cost of health care. It is the number one issue of businesses large and small, and labor unions large and small. They just know that this is an issue that's going to take away their purchasing power for years to come. I like the way that President Obama initiated this. He called a meeting in the White House and invited all stakeholders, everybody, insurance companies, doctors, hospitals, you name it. They all came together in one gathering to talk about how to kick this off. I don't want to be negative toward the Clinton effort when it came to health care reform. I supported it. I thought it was a right thing to do. We needed it then. We still need it now. But it was initiated in a much different way. It was initiated with a product being produced, and then the discussion that followed. The President's trying a different approach. Let's start bringing the groups together to start this conversation. We've set aside money in the budget for health care reform to move toward universal coverage, and I think that that is the best way to get Congress involved. Now, for those who are real C-SPAN junkies, we are going to try to use the reconciliation process. The House wants us to use it. The difference is it is a special legislative process where a simple majority in the Senate is sufficient to pass the bill. It's been used some 19 times in the last 20 years, about 6 times by Democrats, 12 or 13 times by Republicans, and it may be the only way to come up with a health care reform package. At the end of the day, we've got to take the best of this system and preserve it. We've got to acknowledge where there's waste, and there's plenty of waste that's going on here now. And I hope the President's approach, bringing everybody in the room, will be a good starting point.
What are the biggest obstacles to fixing our education system in the U.S., given that many would argue that billions and billions of dollars over many years have been spent without producing meaningful improvements?
Well, let me throw a bouquet to the mayor here, because the first thing when it comes to educational reform is taking on the responsibility. There was a time when a former Secretary of Education came to Chicago and pronounced it the worst school system in America. There was also a time when the mayor of Chicago, who sits to my right and your left, who went to Springfield and said, give me the responsibility, put this on my shoulders. And he deserves special credit for that. He took on this school system. He took on the school system because, as he's told many of us many times, he understood what families look for. They want a safe neighborhood, and they want good schools. And if you don't have good schools, those young 20-somethings who get married and find out they're about to have a baby start looking in the suburbs of where they're going to move after the baby's born. We don't want that to happen in Chicago. We wouldn't want it to happen anywhere. So what are the basics that we need to get to? Well, there's so much that elected officials can do. It starts with the family. I don't know how you can pass a law to do this, but if the family cares, it makes a difference. I used to get a report card every 6 weeks when I went to school, and I knew that I brought it home, and faced the music over the kitchen table as Mom and Dad read through the report card and said, "You can do a lot better than this. And what are all these check marks on this other side over here? Annoys others, does not use time well, all the discipline issues." But my mom and dad cared, and if I had a bad report card, I had a miserable 6 weeks waiting ahead of me. So that's the first thing. Parents accepting responsibility for their own kids, turning off the TV, making sure the homework's done, going to the PTA meetings. Now, what do you do with a situation where you don't have a caring parent, where you deal with a dysfunctional family, where you don't have an educated parent? It's a greater challenge. Teachers have to take on more of the responsibility. I think the biggest single measurement of success in the classroom is the quality of the teacher standing in front of the classroom. We have to really work to reward teachers for the professional services which they do provide us through the schools, but we also have to hold them accountable. If they're not doing the job, if they can't get it done, they have to go. No two ways about it. So we ask for quality, work on it, and make sure at the end of the day that we have good teachers in his classrooms. Michael down here, Michael Koldyke, and I have been to a number of schools together, taking a look at his efforts and his commitment that he has made to a lot of schools in this city. Schools that people have given up on and closed. And thank you for your leadership in this area. You've done some terrific work in this area. We also have to make certain that there is, in fact, options for parents. If a public school is not doing the job, parents should have the option to send their kids to another public school that can do the job and do it as well or better. That kind of competition within the school system is something I could certainly endorse. Charter schools, I believe, are a good idea. There are some represented here this evening, some that I visited in the city of Chicago that I think are doing an exceptional job, creating a learning environment that you won't find in other places. That kind of diversity is important for the future of education.
Do you think the government should have had some foresight before the GM and Chrysler companies got into such a difficult position and before they were provided with billions of dollars in aid?
So 2 years ago, the CEOs of GM, Ford, and Chrysler came to see us, and there were about 6 senators who sat down with them, and I was fortunate to be one of them, and they talked about the status of their car companies. And then they said, "Are there any questions?" Well, nobody had any questions. So I said, "Well, I have a question. First, let me tell you, I buy American cars. I'm one of your best customers. I've owned Fords and Chryslers and Chevys. I'm one of those people that you can count on to buy an American car, okay? The question I have to ask all 3 of you is, have you ever heard of a magazine called Consumer Reports?" There was an awkward silence in the room. And I said, here's why I'm asking this question. For 20 years, I've been subscribing to Consumer Reports, and they do their annual survey of automobiles. And when you look at the survey, you have nothing but red dots, which are good things for those who are making cars in Japan, and nothing but bad scores when it came to all but a few American cars. If we own all the engineering schools and we started this industry, why can't we make a better car that's more reliable and has more trade-in value? They waited and waited, and finally the fellow from Chrysler said, "Well, I think we're getting better." I can't explain this to you. I can't explain how this industry got to the point it is today, but for the fact that many times I think they thought the best recipe for corporate success was to sell more of whatever sold last year. Meanwhile, other companies, like Toyota and their Prius, were looking ahead. What is it that the consumers might need or want tomorrow? And when, of course, the gasoline prices skyrocketed, that turned out to be a fabulous corporate decision. So the obvious question is, what is the responsibility of the government now that these American car companies are struggling? Well, they are a huge part of our economy, a massive part of our economy in virtually every state. We rank 5th in the nation in terms of automobile-related jobs. So this has a lot to do with employment in Illinois. The fear was if we forced them into bankruptcy, people wouldn't buy their cars for fear that the warranties would be worth nothing in a bankrupt car company. And so we held back, waiting for them to mend themselves. Well, it didn't work, and finally the president's given an ultimatum. 30 days for Chrysler to decide whether it merges with Fiat, 60 days for General Motors to make a decision about its future under new corporate leadership. I don't know how this story ends. Losing these car companies would lose a big section of our economy. But I cannot, in good faith, vote to continue to send money into a venture that doesn't have a corporate business plan that I think is ultimately going to succeed. I hope they can rise to that occasion.
Are there any differences between upholding the contracts of the AIG executives and those of the United Auto Workers who are also being asked to make concessions?
You know, I think this gets to the heart of it as to why people were so upset over AIG, because people feel like we're all making a sacrifice here. And for some of these folks to get so-called retention bonuses, to stay in a failed company that only exists because of taxpayers sending $160 billion, as in the case of AIG, is it any wonder that people are upset about it? Plus, and this may be a delicate thing to bring up, but over the last 10 or 20 years, there has been such a growing disparity between the compensation for CEOs and corporations and the income of average people. And that is not being lost on folks that are falling further and further behind. I think it is creating a lot of unrest and unhappiness that was manifest in the negative feelings toward the AIG bonuses. The bottom line is this: United Airlines is in business today, having gone through bankruptcy, because virtually every group of employees was called before the court and had to make a sacrifice, some of them pretty important and significant sacrifices in salary and retirement. It's the only way that the airline survived. I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think Glenn Tilton had any other choice. And I watched him as he brought that company out of bankruptcy and has struggled to keep it flying. The same thing's going to be true when it comes to the auto companies. If they end up in bankruptcy, sacrifices will have to be made by everybody if they are to survive. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. At the end of the day, if they are a restructured company, leaner, more profitable, with a greater future, that's good for them and it's good for our economy.
Could you explain your support for the Employee Free Choice Act, aka card check, and do you think there are enough votes in this Congress to pass it?
I was expecting that question. Under the current law, if you have a business which is not organized, not unionized, and there is an effort to unionize it, the process goes as follows. Cards are distributed to employees. When a majority of the employees sign on the card, say that they're interested in joining a union, those cards are then presented to the management. The management, under the current law, has two choices: to recognize the union or to call for an election, which could take place months later. That's the current law. It's the employer's choice as to whether there's an election. This proposal, the Employee Free Choice Act, turns the tables. It was sponsored by labor unions and labor organizations, and they argued that if you get a majority of the employees to sign the cards that they want to be part of a union, that's enough. 30% of them could request an election, 30% of the employees, but if they don't request an election, a majority of the card signers are enough to unionize a business. There are other provisions in there about mediation, arbitration, penalties for businesses that don't cooperate, and the like. Where is it politically? Well, my job in the Senate goes back to the first thing you learned in the first grade, learning how to count. And my job as whip is to count to the number 60. It takes 60 votes out of 100 senators to pass anything that's controversial. Currently, there are 58 Democratic senators when Ted Kennedy's in good health, and 59 if the Minnesota contest comes our way. But it's still short of 60. So in order for this to pass, if every Democrat supported it, we would need the support of a Republican senator, at least one, maybe more, I think more. The only senator who voted for it on the Republican side the last time it came before us was Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania. 2 weeks ago, Specter announced that he wasn't going to support it as written. End of story. It has stopped in its tracks. I think this. Before the end of the day, I think what will emerge is something between the two scenarios I just described to you, the current law and the proposed law. There is an appetite among many workers for collective bargaining rights. There is an appetite among many business owners to stop unions from organizing. So we have to try to find some reasonable alternative to allow a democratic process in the workplace. The bill as written and proposed at this point does not have the votes and is not going forward.
Are you concerned that the Massachusetts experiment in universal health care has run into enormous costs and problems and therefore will have an impact on the attempt to reform health care nationally?
Well, Bill, what happened there, of course, was under Governor Romney and had the support of Democrats and Republicans to create universal health care in the state of Massachusetts with mandatory employer obligations. They miscalculated the number that would sign up. It turned out to be dramatically larger. They had to increase the contributions to the program and the cost of the program because there were many more participating in it than they had anticipated. I don't know ultimately if that's going to work, but I will say this. I think it is healthy for us to at least have this state effort underway in other states as well to see what will work when it comes to health care reform. I think that universal coverage has to be our goal. Bringing everybody into protection of health insurance is essential. We have some people here from hospitals. I saw Pat Magoon from Children's and others. They end up taking in uninsured people who don't have any way to pay, and they absorb the cost and pass it along to the rest of the families that do have health insurance. We've got to find some way to bring this into universal coverage. I have one bill that I worked on for a number of years, and it's called SHOP. And it was really created with the option of giving small businesses a chance to pool and to find private insurance they can afford. The National Federation of Independent Businesses elected a new president a couple years ago, and he asked if he could see me. I was anxious to see him because his organization had never supported me in any election, and I wanted to see what he looked like. So he came in the office and he said, my goal is to provide health insurance for small businesses. And I said, well, I'm working on that now. The Federal Employees Health Benefit Program is a great program. My wife and I are under it. We have 9 choices of private health insurance companies in Illinois. The government pays 70% of the premium. We pay the difference. We want a big policy. More comes out of my paycheck. If we don't like the policy, at the end of 1 year, there's open enrollment to go in another. So I was trying to create the same scenario for small businesses. Then I had a meeting with the realtors. And the realtors came in and talked about a lot of issues, and I asked, what about health insurance? And the head of the Illinois Association of Realtors said, oh, it's a big problem. 1 out of 4 realtors in Illinois has no health insurance. They're self-employed people, can't afford it. So we brought the realtors and the National Federation of Independent Business together, and we wrote the bill that allows for pooling of small businesses, even self-employed people in each state, for private insurance companies to bid for their business. And then, just to see what had happened, I called Andy Stern at the Service Employees International Union. They have more union members in small businesses than any other union. He said, I'll endorse it. So we ended up with the endorsement of NFIB Realtors and the SEIU. I brought this forward for the administration to take a look at. I hope they include it in their health care reform plan. I think it's a way to provide more coverage. The vast majority of uninsured people are either owners or workers in small businesses.
Do you think the administration's vetting process for senior people has become too stringent, such that very qualified people do not want to subject themselves to such scrutiny?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. When we got into this question of whether you'd paid all your taxes that you should have paid, which is a legitimate question, there's no question about it, we started running into problems. We started finding people that when they looked very carefully at tax returns from years gone by, somebody said, well, no, maybe you should have paid this one. And as a result, some people were open to criticism, including the Treasury Secretary. Some withdrew, including Senator Daschle. And the last I spoke to Rahm Emanuel, some 30 nominees had basically withdrawn their names from the vetting process. Now, I will just tell you this. If you applied that standard to every member of Congress, I think that you might have a little different result. I do my best, and we all do, but we all make mistakes and we all make omissions when it comes to tax returns. I think we've got to look at the bottom line here. It is tough enough to get people to engage in public service, many times taking a substantial cut in pay, sacrificing their personal and family lifestyle. I think we ought to have an honest approach when it comes to vetting. If there is a serious problem with the nominee, that's another story. But if it's something that really is marginal, I hope that we'll err more often on the side of giving that person a chance to serve.
And our final question of the evening, while we're fortunate to obviously have many excellent and honest public officials in Illinois. There has been so much corruption, so much international attention, national and international in Illinois. What sort of things would you recommend that steps be taken in the state in order to change that image?
Bill mentioned to you that I came to this business as a disciple of two people, former Senators Paul Douglas and Paul Simon. Douglas goes back, 43 years ago, so many people don't remember him. I think Newt Menow would remember Paul Douglas. And then, of course, Paul Simon, who was a friend of both of ours as well. And Paul Simon really took over in public service from Paul Douglas. These men really made a point of pushing the integrity issue. Some said they went to extremes. But the fact is that when it came to disclosure, they made complete disclosure. As long as I've been around this business, I have disclosed as a candidate and elected official a complete financial disclosure every year, detailed disclosure of net worth and every income tax return since I've been involved. Simon used to say, you know, when it's all over, my critics jump all over me for my votes, but I don't want them to ever question my honesty. So he went a little further than most, and I've tried to follow in his tradition. But let me say this. The vast majority of men and women in public life that I have served with in Washington and in Illinois are honest, hardworking people. Whether you're in business, labor, church groups, politics, you're always going to have people that disappoint you. It happens. Those in public life get a lot more attention because of the high profile and the importance of the jobs that they have. But I think the overwhelming number of people that I work with are honest people, not trying to make a buck out of this business at all. How should we improve it? Well, I'll just tell you what I would do at the federal level, and it could apply at least some degree at the state level. I'm in favor of public financing of congressional campaigns. I will tell you that the current system that we have is unsustainable. What it costs to run in this state for the United States Senate in a contested race could be well over $10 million, even $20 million or more. If you are not independently wealthy, you will spend more of your time raising that money from wealthy people and from other groups when you should be spending it getting to know the people and the issues that you're going to represent. I think public financing is the way. I've just reintroduced my bill on public financing in congressional campaigns. Arlen Specter is my co-sponsor. We have a Democrat and Republican sponsorship in the House of Representatives as well. I think that's the best way to clean up the system.
Thank you very much. Senator, on behalf of the Economic Club of Chicago, we welcome you. We thank you very much for your comments, and we thank you for your leadership on behalf of our state. The evening is over.
I hope you didn't think that was a negative when I said you remember Paul Douglas. I heard somebody over there laughing. I didn't mean to at all.
Remember, I was chairman of. I was chairman of every one of those.
Were you really? Well, he got me in this business. My only son is Paul Douglas Durbin.
He was the same. Listen, that was a terrific talk.
Thanks, dude.
What a good day. Breakfast and dinner with you.
It's got lunch for you.
Yeah, I did. I did work for you.